Penguin Random House Audio presents The Rising, the 20-year battle to rebuild the World Trade Center by Larry Silverstein. Read for you by Fred Sanders. To my wife, Clara, the joy of my life, 68 years and still going strong. Disclaimer. This is a work of nonfiction in which the author has reconstructed dialogue to the best of his recollection. Prologue. The doctor didn't save me, the appointment did. Or more precisely, my wife's insistence that I keep it. If I hadn't listened to Clara on that fateful morning of September 11th, 2001, the day the world changed for me and so many others, things might have turned out very differently. When I woke up that bright, late summer Tuesday, my intention was to head downtown from our apartment on Park Avenue and have my usual 8:30 breakfast at Windows on the World. This was the restaurant on the 107th floor of the North Tower of the World Trade Center in Lower Manhattan. It had been my routine for the past 2 months to use these breakfasts to meet with the building's major tenants. Now, you might think that would take years. The towers, after all, contained 10 million square feet of office space, enough to fill 174 football fields laid out goalpost to goalpost. However, only 40 companies accounted for about 70% of the occupants. And so I had already made my way pretty far down the list and had gotten a good sense of how many of the primary renters felt about working in the complex. It had been a valuable education. And while Windows, even at breakfast, was often fully booked, I could always be sure of getting a good table, one looking north up the blue ribbon of the Hudson River with the greatest city in the world, vibrant and splendid, spread out before me. You see, I owned the Twin Towers. Owned is actually a bit of shorthand for a more complicated contractual reality. On July 24, 2001, just 50 days earlier, after signing a 1,160-page agreement with the Port Authority, the joint venture of the states of New York and New Jersey that controlled the 16 acres of land and the buildings that constituted the World Trade Center complex, New York Governor George Pataki had handed me a set of oversized cardboard keys to the Twin Towers. And while the gigantic keys were a bit of vaudeville humor from the usually dour governor, I did in fact now have a 99-year lease on what were at the time the two largest buildings in the world. And I had previously handed over a $3.2 billion check for this leasehold. My monthly rent bill was $10 million. The weekday breakfasts, then, were pretty important to me. One of the first rules I had learned in what had been up to that point nearly a half-century in the real estate business is that it's crucial to keep your tenants happy. You should get to know their needs, learn how you can help them. It's a process. Both landlord and tenant must get to know each other. You just don't come in one day and announce that you're raising the rent. However, that morning, another of the cardinal rules I had learned after a lifetime of experience took precedence. When my wife insists, my answer is always a succinct, "Yes, dear." It's an insight that has kept me very happily married for the past 68 years. I had previously scheduled a 9 a.m. appointment with my dermatologist, whose office up on 60th and Madison was just a short walk from our apartment. It was my running joke that I was her annuity. She was always finding something troublesome that needed to be removed. But I guess that was the price I had to pay for being fair-skinned and for my favorite hobby. Back in 1960, after Sharon, our first child, had been born, Roger would arrive 3.5 years later, Lisa in 1966, we were spending the summer away from our stuffy apartment in Washington Heights at a rented house in Stamford, Connecticut, and on a whim we had bought a boat for $2,500. We called it The Last Penny, because that pretty much summed up our situation after our impetuous purchase. But Clara and I discovered we loved being out on the water, and in the winters we diligently spent a good deal of time taking maritime instructional courses. As our family grew and my business prospered, and even after Lisa was born, and we moved to a spacious 5-bedroom house in White Plains, we continued to spend vacations on the water, and over time upgraded to bigger and better boats. Our newest, the Silver Lease, named after our daughters Sharon and Lisa, is a 180-foot, 4-deck, custom-built beauty with a gleaming cerulean blue hull. It's a very comfortable floating home with all the amenities you could ask for, including a gym, a small reverse current pool, and even an elevator, as well as a full-time crew and a state-of-the-art navigation system that could guide an ocean liner through a storm. We've happily cruised all over the world, and during these voyages, I've continued to spend too much time exposed to the glaring sun. The frequent visits to the dermatologist were the annoying price I had to pay for my blissful holidays on the water. But on the morning of September 11th, as I was getting dressed, I abruptly decided to cancel my doctor's appointment. There was just too much work to do downtown at the Trade Center. As the new landlord, I should be meeting with tenants at breakfast, not spending time at the dermatologist. I told Clara that I'd reschedule. "You canceled last time," she reminded me forcefully. "This is your health. You can't cancel again." I could see she was upset, very upset. And so I didn't go down to Windows on the World that morning. I was not seated at my usual table on the 107th floor of the North Tower when the first plane crashed into the building at 8:46. Instead, I was preparing to leave for the dermatologist when the phone rang. Clara answered it. "Is Mr. Silverstein okay?" the captain of our boat asked anxiously. "Yes," said Clara. "Why would you ask?" The boat was docked at Chelsea Piers on 23rd Street. Standing on the deck, the captain could see the plume of dark smoke escaping in a thick, ominous cloud from Tower 1. But he didn't try to explain. Instead, he tersely instructed, "Turn on your television set." What can I say about the rest of that day? The precise details are buried deep in my mind. Even decades later, they are apparently too painful to relive fully. What I do recall is a series of opaque images, the events blurred like photographs that were never fully developed. My memory has always been one of my prides, and I would often boast about it. But when I try to look back on that grim day, I'm overwhelmed. I can recall only moments, intimations of what I'd lived through. There I was, still in the apartment, Clara and I watching the television in stunned silence, when the second plane abruptly turned north and slammed into the South Tower. How can this be happening? My mind screamed. And what about my children? Both Roger and Lisa worked in the Trade Center complex, and the people who worked for me. We had temporary offices on the 89th floor. I hoped they hadn't arrived before 9. When I tried to call their cells, the office, nothing. All the phones were down in Lower Manhattan, and it would remain that exasperating way all day. I needed to know that my children, my employees, my tenants were alive, and I could not reach anyone. Then the towers fell. They started to crumble, and just like that, they were gone. One moment they were there, and then they weren't. I was absolutely staggered. I couldn't believe what I was seeing with my own eyes. Yet in the next instant, my bewilderment gave way to prayers. Where were my children? My employees? Suddenly, I realized I needed to get to our office at 521 Fifth Avenue on 44th Street. It became very important, the only thing that mattered. I wanted to get some sort of control over the rushing surge of events, and I unreasonably decided that if I was in the office, seated at my desk, order would be restored. The world I once knew would be reinstated. When I arrived, Ann Tobin, who had been my assistant for 37 years, was already there. She knew better than to try to speak. All she could do was shake her head mournfully. Throughout the day, our conference room began to fill with people. They were the wives and husbands of our employees. It was a community of strangers suddenly linked by common prayers, by wishful hopes. My children, thank God, made it to the Fifth Avenue office. Both Roger and Lisa had stories to tell, tales of fortuitous escapes. Their arrivals created a surge of hope in the anxious relatives of the missing who were crowded into the conference room. Then, at around 3 p.m., Bill DeCunto, the man who was second in command of all our buildings, arrived. He was completely covered in ash, a gray, ghost-like presence. I couldn't recognize him at first. "Bill?" I finally ventured. He nodded mutely. "How did you get here?" "Walked." "From downtown?" I asked incredulously. It must have been 5, perhaps 6 miles. "It was the only way," he explained with resignation. I led Bill into the conference room so he could share what he knew.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?